along, and they'll be read out towards the end. Now I'm going to pass things along to my colleague, Sarah Clark.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Clark, and I am the new Director of Policy here at the Seattle Metropolitan Chamber of Commerce. I am very excited to welcome you to today's chamber briefing. The topic is the state of our childcare industry. I just want to give a quick disclaimer before we get started. The information and opinions presented in today's briefing are strictly those of the panelists and their respective organizations. Okay, let's get started. We have a great panel for you today. First, I'm going to introduce Ryan Pricco, one of the 3 tri-chairs from the Childcare Collaborative Task Force, also Director of Policy and Advocacy at Childcare Aware of Washington. Ryan, thank you for joining us today. We also have Seattle Metro Chamber member, President and CEO of KidsCo, a nonprofit child care center, and the director of the Seattle Child Care Business Coalition with us today, Susan Brown. Susan, thank you for your partnership on this event, and thank you for joining us today. And last but certainly not least, we have the Director of Community Engagement and Outreach from the Washington State Department of Commerce, Cheryl Smith, with us today. Cheryl also played a critical role in convening, coordinating, researching, and developing the Child Care Collaborative Task Force, their report, and their reports. Welcome, Cheryl. We're so glad that you're here. So let's take a moment to get grounded in the regional childcare landscape here in Washington. We've recently come out of a worldwide COVID-19 pandemic with high inflation rates and supply chain issues, as well as a myriad of other challenges. In our research here at the Seattle Metro Chamber, almost 3/4 of Seattle voters have identified that lack of access to high quality, affordable childcare is one of the top issues negatively impacting their quality of life. What does that mean for childcare? Well, the prices are high, the demand is high, but the supply is low, and there are a variety of barriers parents face trying to access the system. Furthermore, the childcare market is not a typical business market in many ways. So for our panelists, our first question, from each of your perspectives, if you could talk about how we got here, what policies or lack thereof led us to this moment in the childcare industry, and if you could touch on what role the pandemic played, that would be great as well. Susan, why don't we start with you for this question?
Okay, thank you, Sarah. It's actually a very complicated answer to what sounds like a very simple question, because childcare is a complicated business. First of all, it's part of the human services industry, but is often seen as part of the education system when we don't get the funding like the education system gets. So how we got here today is a myriad of policies and childcare regulations where I would say childcare voice was not as well considered in terms of the the real implementation of the policies and the day-to-day work of childcare and how to deliver the service in the best way possible for the benefit of kids and families. So that's my answer to how we got here today.
Thank you, Susan. Ryan, how would you respond to this question?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to be a part of this panel. I really appreciate it. I agree with everything Susan just said, and I think the only thing I would reiterate is the investment piece. A lack of investment is really the reason why we're in the place that we are. Childcare is our nation's largest early learning system. So childcare is education. It is a part of the education continuum, and it's the most important part of the education continuum. According to every bit of research we have, over 90% of a child's brain develops before they ever set foot in a kindergarten classroom. And more, those kids are spending the majority of their time with childcare educators. So really, childcare educators, teachers, directors, owners, they are our most important educators, but they're the only educators in our society that we don't invest directly into with public funds. K-12 teachers are state employees, and they're paid at a level to make sure that they can be qualified and available in every community. The state and federal government invest directly into our higher education educators, and we just don't do that in the early ed space, even though that's really where we can get the biggest return on investment. In terms of how the pandemic has impacted all of this and where we're at right now, I think that the pandemic was two-sided for childcare. On one hand, it clearly demonstrated how essential childcare educators are. They were deemed essential workers. The media, I think, did a good job of covering everything that they went through and really articulating the fundamental role that they play in our society, in our economy. And that resulted in historic investment into childcare, particularly from the federal level, where we saw $50 billion get invested in the industry in order to save the industry. The problem with that, though, is that money was one time. It's been spent. It had an impact, which I think we'll get into more details about later on. But now that money's gone, and we're seeing a full-blown staffing crisis play out in childcare because of the pandemic. 80% of programs are reporting staff shortages. The New York Times estimates that 10% of our childcare workforce left it because we compete with low-income industries for those people. And as a result of the pandemic, a lot of those industries like retail, hospitality, et cetera, are actually raising their wages to bring people back. And small childcare businesses don't have the capacity to do that.
Wow, thank you so much, Ryan. And Cheryl, can you touch on the economic perspective here at the state level? What are your thoughts?
Thank you, Sarah. I also agree with what Susan and Ryan said. You know, the Child Care Task Force has issued 5 legislative reports and also co-published another report before the onset of the pandemic. And even before the pandemic, it was estimated through that study that employers incurred over $2.08 billion a year in costs related to employee turnover or missed work due to childcare issues. And that was before the pandemic, before we lost about 10% of our childcare workforce. And so I can only imagine what the actual calculations would be right now. It's been a huge impact on our economy. We can't have a healthy economy if we don't have childcare. We've done some other studies where we looked at access to childcare, and we've seen that 60% of children who need childcare live in areas that are called childcare deserts, where there's inadequate access to childcare. And a lot of this has to do with what Susan and Ryan were talking about, which is that we rely on our childcare system to operate like a private market, but it can't and it won't. Parents can't pay, and that means that the workforce isn't fairly compensated. So it's a vicious cycle, that's interconnected. One of the things we're really excited about is that we finally have a way to actually calculate the real cost of providing quality care for our kids. The task force's recent report includes a cost of quality care tool where we can actually look at what does it actually cost to provide early childhood education for these kids and provide a decent living wage for the providers. And the tool is very easy to access. It's in an Excel spreadsheet. It's on our website, and you can actually calculate what is the cost of providing quality care. And therefore you can see the difference, the gap between what's happening now and what it would give our most important educators.
What a great resource. Thank you, Cheryl, for sharing that information with us. Ryan, I'm going to follow up with you. You mentioned there were some public dollars invested during the pandemic to, use your words, save the industry. And those came from the Department of Children, Youth and Families, DCYF, who did a lot of work distributing that money to providers. Could you tell us a little bit more about this program? Will those dollars continue in the 2023-25 biennium? From your opinion, could the industry survive without those dollars?
Well, I would say the industry will struggle to survive without ongoing investment, and it certainly will not grow to meet demand for childcare without public investment. The stabilization grants, as I mentioned earlier, were funded by the federal government that really prioritized childcare relief and all of their COVID relief packages to the tune of $50 billion that was invested nationwide. And here in our state, as you mentioned, DCYF had the authority to distribute that money. Most of it went out in the forms of stabilization grants, which are just kind of flexible dollars that went to programs with the intention of keeping their staff in place and keeping their doors open so that firefighters and nurses and doctors throughout the pandemic could still bring their kids somewhere and go to work when we all needed them to do so. This was happening at a time when enrollment in childcare dropped by nearly 50%. And so that means income that these programs rely upon to keep their businesses open month to month also dropped by nearly 50%. We saw over a third of our workforce either get laid off or furloughed in a matter of weeks once the pandemic launched. So without this money, we very well could have seen the collapse of the industry. In fact, Washington STEM worked with the state to basically analyze these grants and estimate the impact of them. And they estimated over 60,000 childcare slots were saved by the investment of these grants. And for those that don't know the system that well, that's over a third of our entire industry statewide that they estimated were directly saved by these grants. The problem is that they were one time, but they were hugely impactful. At Childcare Aware, we have a great data collection operation that we operationalize throughout our coaching infrastructure, our training infrastructure. We have connections with the vast majority of the workforce, and we were supporting the entire workforce through the pandemic. And through all those interactions, we were basically doing an ongoing real-time survey of providers to figure out what does your enrollment look like? Are you open, close? How many slots are you offering? And the biggest takeaway I had throughout all that time reading those reports is that whenever a new round of stabilization grants ran out, we would see spikes in the number of programs that were open, the number of slots that they made available, and more accessibility for working families at that time. So the stabilization grants demonstrated that when we invest, in global terms, a modest amount of money into this industry, these programs and these people do incredible things with it. And if that money could be ongoing, then we could really see them do some incredible things in providing quality care for every child statewide that needs it.
Oh, that's wonderful. Sounds like those dollars were much needed and continue to be needed. Cheryl, has the Department of Commerce done anything to support the economic development of the childcare businesses during this time?
Well, that's a great question. It was DCYF, Department of Children, Youth and Families, that was able to provide those stabilization grants. That's not something that we actually did at Commerce, but we are working to try to help support the entire industry and the economy. One of our jobs at Commerce is we promote Washington's economy. So that means that one of our roles is to do employer recruitment, expansion, and retention. I cannot tell you how often employers and prospective employers and current employers that are thinking about expanding are asking about childcare because they know that this is a critical issue for retaining good employees. And a number of communities have lost the ability to attract new employers because of the lack of childcare. And that's really sad. So we are very concerned about it from an economic development standpoint. One of the things that we have since I think 2016 is a capital funding program. It's called the Early Learning Facilities Fund. And there's capital available for childcare businesses and to make improvements. There's a lot of different sub-funding categories within the Early Learning Facilities Fund. but it's been very, very helpful in being able to help stabilize and expand and just support the childcare industry. And one of the ways that that we're actually helping with that is that we've established a program, a small grant program called the Childcare Partnership Grants. And these are small grants plus assistance in capacity building and partnership. We fund community coalitions who know that they have childcare shortages, and we fund them to come together to figure out what is their highest need and what would they need to do to, address that need. And we've been funding 41 different community partnerships in the last couple of years. 11 of those have gone on to be able to be successful in getting the early learning facilities funding grants. So this is working, but not all of them have a capital project to do. Some of the other things that they're doing are they're supporting childcare providers in many different ways in their communities. This has been a very high impact and low investment capacity building program, and we're really hoping to expand it. One of the other things I want to mention is that the Department of Children, Youth, and Families also has some funding for additional technical assistance for childcare providers that are in pre-licensing, so they're not actually licensed yet or in the licensing process formally, but they need to talk to someone to try to figure out if they could make their childcare business work or make changes to it or expand it and take more kids or whatever. And they also at DCYF can help employers who are interested in supporting and perhaps an on-site childcare facility for their employees. So we're helping in the ways that we can right now, and we hope to do even more.
All right, well, now we are going to pivot now that we've laid the groundwork for where we are in this moment and talk about the space that brought all three of you together, the Childcare Collaborative Task Force. And for those who don't know, this is a governor-appointed task force that was originally created by our state legislature in 2018 with a narrow focus on employer-supported childcare. The group was extended and expanded in 2019 with the passage of House Bill 1344 to include childcare providers in this task force, as well as advocates, childcare workforce development and labor groups, business associations, and employers, as well as state agencies and legislators. Over the past 4 years, since the expansion of the task force, both in participants and purview, there have been several benchmarks and reports submitted to the legislature, which Cheryl mentioned, culminating with the most recent report released in December of last year, 2022, called The True Cost of Quality Care in Washington. So Cheryl, let's start with you on this topic. Can you share with our members how the work of the task force changed from its original narrow focus on employer-supported childcare to now? And tell us a little bit about what informed those changes.
Yes, Sarah, thank you for that question. There have been a lot of changes since the task force was established and had its first meeting in July of 2018, and some things that haven't changed. That first report that we issued in November of 2019 really was looking at how to support childcare providers and the workforce, thinking things about streamlining permitting, reducing disparities in childcare service delivery, and incentivizing employer-supported care. So we had a number of employers represented on the task force at that time. And one of the other things that we did that didn't change is that we had about 43, 44 members at that time who were appointed to the task force. And we worked together to create a vision statement for the future of Washington's childcare system. And that remains strong today, and we're still very committed to it, which is why this work is so important. And I'd like to read that, that vision statement. The task force envisions Washington State as the nation's most equitable, affordable, and accessible childcare system that benefits all our children, parents, childcare staff and providers, employees, and communities. So we have some platforms underneath that, which I won't read, but I think that that is a really compelling vision statement for what we want the future childcare system to be like in the state of Washington. And as you mentioned, after we did that initial report, the task force was extended and the makeup of the task force was changed to pivot away from only focusing on employers and their nexus with the childcare system, to actually doing some more research, to really digging into figuring out what is the gap that we have between where we are today and what is that vision statement, and how can we reach that vision. So we have done a total of 5 legislative reports, as I mentioned. We've looked at the whole childcare industry and done a facilities needs assessment, and that's where we realized that large part of the state is classified as a childcare desert, and it's very difficult to get childcare. We've done a childcare cost model that I mentioned, where we can actually look at what it takes to provide quality childcare to kids in different settings. We've looked at compensation policies. We've looked at the subsidy program. We've looked at what would have to happen for the childcare system to actually work the way that we all want it to. And we recently just published that cost of care study and model. And I want to mention that just for a second, because we did a lot of work on that, and we brought in a nationwide, nationally known consulting firm that has done these studies in other states. And this was done with provider surveys, focus groups, interviews, and research to understand and carefully document the expenses and revenues for licensed childcare programs to be able to build this model. And so it's just such an excellent tool, and the disparity between, again, where we are today and where we need to be is the thing that we really need to address. And so we made recommendations around that. So that's one of the ways it's changed. We changed the focus to dig in and actually document and research, how do we get from where we are? This is not just about employers. This is about our whole society really standing behind early childhood and raising our next generation of the workforce in our society. And it's really that critically important. And so that's been really the big pivot point, in my opinion. Ryan probably has a lot to say about this too.
Yeah, thank you, Cheryl. Ryan, we'll get to you in a moment as one of the tri-chairs. Very interested to hear feedback from you. But Susan, I want to turn to you here and ask you to share with our members a bit about your experience as a child care provider on the task force, and about your perspective regarding the impact that the expansion of perspectives on the task force, how did that contribute to the outcomes? And do you believe this is a model that could be replicated in other childcare advocacy spaces?
Sure, thank you. First, I want to thank Cheryl and her team for their gracious welcoming of feedback and recommendations from Childcare Voice. Because one thing we do know is that robbing from the Hamilton musical, we want to be in the room where it happens, because quite often Childcare Voice is not. And their welcoming of us has made a difference, because what's the new saying now? Nothing about us without us. That's really how it should be, because we have to live the policies they impose upon us. Using the example of the Early Learning Facilities Fund, it's a great fund if you can find a building that you can afford the lease rate and the tenant improvements and so on and so forth. And there's a funding cycle that doesn't necessarily always line up with when a provider finds a facility, so on and so forth. So there are some great programs out there, but they're not as easily accessible because timing plays a role in accessing those funds, but also the inventory of properties that can be licensed, that have access to a playground area or a place where you can build a playground, and is at an affordable lease rate, are almost non-existent. And I think Ryan and Cheryl would concur with me on that, that it's next to impossible. So expanding childcare without cooperation of business and development and all the other things that play into our economy, there will be no expansion of childcare because there won't be a place to do it. The task force has been instrumental in informing and educating a wide variety of people about the complexities of childcare, the licensing rules that impact it, and why it's so important that we make more investment, not just from the providers themselves sacrificing and family subsidizing, but really significant investment from government and support from business. So I can't speak more highly about the task force and their work because it is making a difference. I will say though that the pandemic might be over for some, but it isn't for childcare, and we need help now, not future. And this is where we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. There's great ideas, but they're not making a difference right now.
Thank you for sharing that perspective with us, Susan. Now, Ryan, I'm going to turn to you. I would love if you could share with our members the major findings of the task force's research, as well as the recommendations that you all made to the governor.
Yeah, love to. I think coming into the task force, there were things that we knew. Probably the biggest thing that everyone in that room understood is how important early education is for our children and how critical early brain development is. As the late great Bill Gates Sr. used to say, the first 5 years of a person's life will tell you an awful lot about the next 80 years of their life. And that still holds true. And the task force kind of convened with that principle in mind. I think what we learned throughout the process of the task force is how critical childcare is to the economy. And the pandemic coming in at the end of it really shined a bright light on that. And our further analysis of the industry and of that economic impact has really demonstrated how broken the childcare market is. To put it simply, parents can't afford to access childcare, and childcare teachers can't afford to stay in the industry. On one side, we have, I think our analysis showed the average family with an infant and a toddler that needs childcare will spend over 30% of their household income, and that's a two-parent household income on childcare. For single parents, that number jumps up to almost their entire paycheck if you have two kids that need full-time childcare. So that's just not working for most of Washington's families. And on the flip side, childcare educators rank in the 3rd percentile of all of our occupational wages. They make less than parking lot attendants and pet groomers. So currently right now in this state, we're paying people more money to care for our pets and our cars than our young children when over 90% of their brain develops. Personally, what I think coming away from the task force, the game changer for me is that cost of quality care study that Cheryl was talking about. That study now quantifies the gap between what young families can afford and what programs need in order to provide quality care. We have clear data now that demonstrates that dynamic and how that continues to be a drag on the industry and the economy overall. And we're really, really hopeful that the state will now use that study and use that data to reimburse programs for the full cost of quality care, and ultimately take it a step further and use it to finance a more comprehensive system that enables all families who need care to be able to access it and afford it.
Well, that's fantastic. And I want to take us off on a high note here and ride on the hope of the task force and the data that will inform our lawmakers and spark creativity at a time as we are also starting to reimagine our urban centers and what inclusive communities really look like. So my question is, from each of your perspectives, how should we include childcare in that conversation around reimagining our communities. And is there a place for the broader business community in the work of building a better childcare system? And lastly, if each of you could share with us a bit about what you're looking forward to on the horizon, and specifically related to childcare, and maybe touch on the coalition of folks who are committed to building a better childcare system. Brian, why don't we start with you on this question?
Sure. Well, I definitely think that there's a place for the business community to, play a role in childcare, because childcare has a huge impact on the business community, for right or wrong. Right now it's a drag on the economy, and I think the task force's analysis clearly showed that if childcare wasn't a barrier for working parents, it would really unleash the business community, it really unleash manufacturing in this state, really unleash, industries that are lagging behind, that are really struggling to recruit good people into their positions right now, because childcare remains such a huge barrier. And really, if you get into the details of all the research and work that task force did, the thing that we kept coming back to is that poverty wages of childcare educators continues to be the biggest barrier to having a system that everyone can access and benefit from. Cheryl mentioned earlier that we have a cost estimate attached to that now, over $2 billion in direct cost to Washington employers every year, just due to turnover related to childcare. And that same analysis, extrapolated out to opportunity costs in the economy at large, and concluded that equates to over $6 billion a year that we lose out of our state's economy just because of childcare issues. Understanding all of this and understanding, how much of an urgency we had with our staffing crisis coming out of the pandemic, Childcare Aware pulled together what we're calling our early educator compensation design team. It's a representative group of childcare educators from across the state, many of Susan's colleagues from across the state, including members of the Seattle Childcare Business Coalition, that we've been supporting as policy leads and advocates themselves, really trying to operationalize what Susan was saying earlier, that childcare educators need to be at the table whenever anything about their programs and their industry is being discussed. They need to be the ones that really set the vision and lead us to a better industry. And we've been supporting them through a liberatory design process to figure out what is that vision, and ultimately what policies and funding streams do we need to advocate for. They identified things that they're working on this legislative session. They've identified a lot of things they want to work on in the long term. But first and foremost, what they identified is the task force's recommendations. And those recommendations, including, using public dollars to cap expenses for families at 7% of their annual income, and then use those funding streams and the cost of quality study to actually reimburse programs for the full cost of care. That would give programs the income that they need in order to hire people back and give them the wages that they deserve for being our most important educators. So our design team right now is working with the state legislature, basically asking for a budget proviso that would require the state to develop that plan, to do the cost modeling, figure out how much it will cost, to figure out IT needs, to figure out statutory changes that would need to take place, and eventually get that in the budget, so that, again, providers like Susan can sit down with the state and work directly with them to develop that plan and identify those changes that are needed, and really take back control of their industry. So I'm gonna go ahead and drop into the chat. We have a link to a sign-on letter that we're having organizations sign on to if they support that vision. In this letter, you'll see the actual language of the proviso itself. Anybody on this webinar that really supports that vision and is able to put their organization on there, we would love your support. And we're going to send this letter to budget leaders in Olympia and use it to encourage them to help us lead this industry into a better place that'll really benefit all of Washington's families and its economy.
Wow, that's exciting. Cheryl, I'm going to turn to you. What are you looking forward to on the horizon?
Well, I think I agree with Ryan. I actually think there's a role for all of us, because we all care about childcare, and boy, did we get a wake-up call when COVID happened. And all of a sudden, you know, it was just completely unstable and unpredictable, and people were doing their best. And the childcare industry did an incredible job of caring for our kids. But I think we all saw what the impact was. And so I'm looking forward to a couple of things. One of the things I'm looking forward to is what Ryan alluded to, which is, you know, Washington has a subsidy program that families can qualify for, where some of their childcare costs get actually paid for, but it's based on what the market can bear, what the market rates are, instead of the actual costs, as per our cost of care study and the cost of care tool. And so really hoping that policymakers will really look at changing that subsidy program to be based on actual cost of care, which the Department of Children, Youth and Families is getting ready to enter into a process to take this study that we've done and do the analysis to figure out how that could happen. So that would mean that childcare providers are more able to take subsidy families and care for them, because the reimbursement rate would be more generous and more appropriate. But also looking at expanding who's eligible for that subsidy program, because people can't pay 35% of their two income wages toward childcare and still, you know, live a vibrant life in this economy, even in the middle class, let alone single family workers. So I'm really looking forward to the cost of care study actually getting implemented in that way. And I'm also looking forward to continuing to work with employers who care very deeply about childcare issues, don't always know what to do. And so I want to mention something that we're working at the Department of Commerce right now that really came out of our 2019 report, which is employers saying, we need assistance to figure out what actions we can take. And so we're really working on that. We've gotten funding through the Fair Start for Kids Act a couple of years ago, and we're developing a program that answers that call. And it will involve really promoting family-friendly workplaces, essentially. And that can range, that's quite a range of activities that employers can look at. Everything from possibly looking at more flexible shifts for their workforce so that they can accommodate childcare, into things like subsidies for some of the childcare costs that their employees are incurring, to looking at human resource policies, things like using paid time off for childcare needs as a possibility, and all the way up the line to where some employers want to have a childcare facility on site for their employees. That's not what a lot of them want, but there's assistance for that, as I already mentioned. So we're rolling out a free program with these resources that we have, where employers can get access to professionals who can advise them about their situation and steps that they might be able to take to work toward a more family-friendly workplace. And there are a lot of things that employers can do, and we're pretty excited about that. And when I think about the wages and how this all comes together, I'll just share something a colleague said to me, because we're thinking about focusing a lot on the manufacturing sector. It's such an important sector in this economy. It's also a high-paying sector, but only 28% of employees in that sector in Washington State are women. And it probably has something to do with childcare. So if more women were in the manufacturing workforce, because they could manage childcare, they would probably have higher wages, and that would contribute to their own wealth. And so that's the sort of thing that we really want to help promote. So I'm looking forward to really being able to dig in with the support of the funding that we got because of the studies that we've done, and figure out how we can better support employers and employees and kids.
Well, that's really exciting, Cheryl. And I'm excited as well to learn more about these tools, and I'm sure our members are as well. And Susan, I'm going to turn the last question over to you, and tell us a little bit about, you know, what you're looking forward to on the horizon, as well as what the Greater Seattle Area Childcare Business Coalition is asking for from other businesses and other advocates.
Certainly, and thank you for the opportunity. First of all, I want to say that I'm hopeful that the cost of care model, estimation model, is actually a tool that is used to influence actual investment in the sector. It's one thing to have the tool, but it's a whole nother thing to take the learnings from the tool, apply it to policy, and then turn that into the investment that's necessary. So that's what I would like to see happen. I would like to also see that the tool is not a one size fits all. Right now, we have a subsidy system and a reimbursement rate that's a statewide market rate. So those of us who provide services in a higher cost area get reimbursed less than as compared to the tuition we charge. So I'm hopeful for all those things with regard to that. I really think it's important that we as a community recognize that childcare, the work of childcare, is what enables all other work. Without it, our economy is stifled and it will not grow. And then I really think it's important that we as a community partner to find solutions like affordable childcare spaces, making sure that not just low income and high income families get support or have the resources they need to afford childcare, but everybody in the middle who currently do not get any investment or support because they're above income in terms of subsidies and below income in terms of affordability on their own. So we have lots of opportunity here to make it better. We just have to have the will and the courage to do it. And Business Voice can lend their voice to that and make it possible. I'm certain of it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. And I just want to take another opportunity to thank all of our panel members, Cheryl, Ryan, Susan, for taking the time to join us today in the middle of a very busy legislative session. For our audience members, please check the chat. Ryan dropped a very important link in there, but the chamber will also be posting some links to some of the reports that our panelists discussed today, as well as links for you to follow up on the advocacy request. So Lily, I'm going to turn things back over to you now.
All right, thank you, Sarah, and thank you to our panelists. I did just send out some helpful links for you all to follow up after this conversation. The link that Ryan mentioned is the Childcare Action Alert under there, if you want to check that out. So we've got some great questions from our attendees. I'm going to try to get through as many as possible, but we are a little bit short on time. So let's start with a question for Ryan. Have there been any legislative or ballot initiative measures discussed modeling a statewide program after the Seattle preschool program? We've seen locally the power of SPP to equitably raise up access for working families. And this person also mentioned that you were quoted in a spokesman review shared by the governor last night talking a bit about universal childcare. So if you could expand upon that a little bit.
Sure. Well, the link that I put in the chat is you'll see in there's a budget request that we're asking state legislators to put into their budget that would require the state to basically develop that initiative at a state level and say, if we wanted to finance universal high quality childcare for everyone that needs it, built on parent choice and community-based programming and quality care for kids, what would it cost? What systems could we leverage in order to make it happen? What new systems would we need in order to do that? What legal and tax questions and barriers are in the way that we need to identify? What federal rules do we need to work with or work around? And so we're trying to get to that point where we have a clear idea of what that state initiative would look like. One thing I do want to say about Seattle preschool and just the concept of universal preschool is it's obviously a great intention, and it's a school readiness initiative that is really geared towards giving kids that foundation for learning before they enter kindergarten, and it does great things. There is a flip side to it, which is the focus on that 4-year-old year takes away from the power of birth to 5 and really birth to 12 programming. And the research is really clear that you really maximize early brain development when kids are able to get quality care from birth to 5. And in fact, over 80% of their brain develops by age 3. So before they could ever enter a pre-K classroom, you've already missed a huge window to really lay that foundation for success in school and life. And we see, for instance, in our K-12 system right now with transitional kindergarten, that school districts are moving aggressively to open up classrooms for 4-year-olds in their community because parents need it. And that's, again, with great intention. But the reality that we see playing out in those communities is that it's forcing birth to 12 childcare programs to close down, because the childcare business model is built on making money on 4-year-olds to offset the losses that you have caring for infants and toddlers. And so when you take away that income from those programs, they can no longer serve infants and toddlers. And we've seen that play out in California, Oklahoma, Tennessee, New York City, where they had UPK initiatives that then saw their birth to 3 offerings either go away or the cost went up sometimes as high as 50%. And so we need to kind of move away from this notion of let's just get everyone a year of preschool before they enter K-12 and then they'll be fine. And instead invest in our existing mixed delivery childcare system and enable families to get quality care from birth to 12. We can't leave out the school age care, component as well. Before and after school is so critical to a child's education and their long-term outcomes. We have that system in place, we just don't invest in it. And then sometimes we do things to invest around it that harms it even more. We just need to focus on a statewide initiative that puts the money in place for both families and educators to provide quality care to children from the moment that they're born.
Great, thank you, Ryan. We also have a question for Cheryl. You mentioned some grant programs offered by the Department of Commerce. Can you talk about what the qualifications are for childcare providers to receive those grants?
I wish I could summarize that. What might be helpful is if I had contact information for who's interested and I could follow up. It's really complex. These are capital programs. They run different cycles. School districts are eligible for some of the early learning facilities funds, and the qualifications are different depending on what funding cycle they're running at any given time. But I'd be happy to send out some information. And also we have a really great team at Commerce that administers that program, and they'd be happy to answer questions about eligibility. It's just not very easy to answer.
Yeah, no problem. We will get that information from you and follow up with folks afterwards.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. I think we're going to wrap up with just one last question from the audience. Looking at the report from the task force, someone was wondering if the study also looked at childcare needs for non-traditional work schedules.
Absolutely, that's definitely part of it. And of course, that's harder to get and it costs more. And it's something we've been talking about and looking at for a while, is that there's great recognition. In fact, one of our childcare partnership grants, those community coalitions that we fund are all sorts of things, like healthcare centers that can't keep employees because they don't have childcare, or local governments even, or advocacy organizations, community foundations. I lost my train of thought. Tell me the rest of your question again. I went off somewhere else. Just a second.
The question was about non-traditional.
Oh, non-traditional. I'm so sorry. Yeah. And so one of the community coalitions that we funded a couple of years ago was the Machinist Institute, really working on an apprentice program that had very non-traditional hours, and people couldn't finish the apprentice program because they couldn't get childcare at the time of day that they needed to be able to show up at the facility. And so there's all sorts of initiatives acknowledging and recognizing that we need non-traditional childcare at non-traditional times. And the huge percentage of parents report that need, by the way. I think it's about 40% in one of our studies report a need for non-traditional, non-Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 childcare. It's everywhere. So that's a really big part of it. And yeah, we're definitely.
Great. Thank you, Cheryl. I'm going to pass things over to Shoshana to wrap things up.
Thank you, everyone. I know we're a bit over time, but thank you for sticking it out with us. And thank you, Sarah, for moderating such an informative discussion. And thank you to our amazing panelists, Susan, Ryan, and Cheryl, for this rich discussion today. And thank you for everyone for sending us your question and joining us for another chamber briefing. If you look in the chat box, you'll see a link to check out all the wonderful events coming up at the chamber, as well as a link to follow up on the information presented today. We hope you enjoyed your program. Thank you and have a great day.